On today's show, we're going to be looking at cooking, how to make the perfect cucumber sandwich and an accompanying fresh tea using mint, lemon, and a little bit of crayfish. Hello and welcome, my fellow GMs, to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. We continue our journey through the practical guide to becoming a great GM. And this week, we're looking at the key principle of a great GM. And hopefully this is going to lock into place stuff that maybe was a little bit uncertain before, but it is an absolute fundamental. So if you watch any one of the videos from this month, this is the video to watch. All right, so please pay attention to that. Now, if you like the series, hit that like button. That's the way that we find out whether people want us to carry on doing these longer series or if you prefer us to go back to the old way. Hit the subscribe button if you really want to show your love and devotion to the channel so you don't ever miss out the opportunity of forgetting about the channel. You go away on holiday and suddenly you go, oh yeah, what was I watching? We'll be in your subscription list, and then you can just click on us and catch up on those videos. And of course, if you slap that little bell, you will get reminded whenever videos drop, which is every Monday and Thursday, although Monday videos are devoted specifically to becoming a better GM. Now, usually we talk about sponsors. This week, we're talking about stuff that we do for you. So our practical guide to becoming a great GM, the book, is available on pre-order. If you head on over to the links down below, you can pre-order the book, and that means you're going to get the PDF somewhere towards the end of April, and the physical book will be shipped out from September onwards. And it's nearly 300 and something pages long, filled with all kinds of stuff. And well, the feedback we've been getting from our alpha readers is it's absolutely brilliant. So check that out. Now, having done due diligence, as they say, in order to keep the lights on, and I mean, last week we had a power failure in mid-recording, so yeah, apparently we need to sell more books. We're talking about the key principle of a GM. And when we're talking about the key, let me rephrase. When people talk about, oh, what's the key? What's the most important thing to remember as a GM? What's the most important thing? What's the most important thing? The most important thing is to have fun. But that doesn't tell you anything about how you actually create your game, how you create your world space, how you create your adventures. That doesn't tell you anything constructive. It's like, have fun. Yeah, okay, fine. But how? How do we do this? So when I talk about the key principle that every GM should have, it's going to sound like a weird one, but the key principle that every GM should have almost tattooed on them somewhere is constraints. Now, I've spoken about them before on the YouTube channel in bits and pieces here and there, and this is why we're doing this whole series, is that you can see how it fits into the grand scheme of things. So we know that adventures need to have a good adventure needs to have player choice. And we know that we need to have certain aspects about ourselves locked down. We know we need to have certain qualities. We need to respect the rules. We need to do this. We need to do that. We need to have all of these kind of things. The biggest principle above all of those things is we need to have constraints. And constraints are particularly important. Why? Well, if I said to you, create an adventure, I've given you no constraints whatsoever. You have no choice. You will create that adventure based on the role-playing system that you like. You might create that adventure based on something that you watched on screen the other day, or that you read the other day, or that you thought about whilst you were sitting on a train going somewhere the other day. Or it's unlikely that you're going to think about stuff that you've thought about in the future. It just doesn't work that way. The bottom line is that you have no constraints. You have no way of anticipating what I could mean, what I could like, what I could want, what I could desire. You're just trying to create an adventure. And then when you hand that adventure over to me, I go, but this isn't what I wanted. Well, that's not fair. I didn't give you any parameters. So constraints, parameters, whatever you want to call them, I like to call them constraints because they help me to think about a narrowing of focus, bringing everything down to a specific point that I will be able to then make useful choices. I'll be able to make choices on the fly. Okay. I'll be able to make choices as things are going on. A lot of people say, oh, I don't know how to create stuff as the adventure's going. I don't know how to create NPCs as the adventure's going. Constraints. Constraints are your friend. learn how to use them, and learn how, hopefully in this video, how to constantly be applying them to the situations that your players are in, or the player characters are in, I should say. Constraints require us to understand all kinds of things. But to begin with, we can fall back on a few solid things that we know for a fact. We can fall back on our rule systems. They're going to give us constraints. No, a character cannot just spontaneously fly. Or, yes, a character can spontaneously fly. Whatever your rule system tells you, that's going to give you just a whole bunch of constraints. You want to run a fantasy game and you're using the Dragon Age role-playing system? Well, that's fine. It's set in a fantasy environment. But if you want to use Call of Cthulhu, it is fantastical in its own kind of way, but I wouldn't list it as being in my top 10 fantasy role-playing games. I would list it in my top 10 horror role-playing games because it's skewed in that kind of direction. So our rules are going to give us some nice constraints. We're going to get constraints potentially from the type of GM that we are. Now that we know the type of GM that we are, we go, oh, well, I'm a narrative GM, so usually I'm going to be telling more story-based stuff than, let's say, for example, rules as written or a rules interpreter. I need to be a little bit more of a rules interpreter, so I'm going to constrain myself to creating an adventure that has more rules stuff in it to force myself to kind of learn more about the rules. Do you see how the constraints just start to focus you down to a specific set of choices rather than to an infinity of choices? Now, once we take those constraints, we need to then start to apply them to the actual adventures that we are creating. And this is where it starts to become a little bit more complex, because you're going, well, yes, I know I have my rules constraints. I have my world space constraints. So if my world space is sci-fi and we're running around in, let's say, the Expanse TV series or book series setting, I can't suddenly have little gray aliens arrive and do their thing because that's not really within that space. Well, kind of, but not really. We need to be able to have something that's going to help us at the adventure level. And so when we get to the adventure level, you now go, okay, well, how do I apply constraints to my adventure? Well, in designing your adventure, you might look at your world map and say, okay, well, I really want the party to go to this area of the map, or the party are heading to that area of the map. What kind of adventures could I give them? What could I give them as options? Look at the map. It's going to give you some constraints. Well, you can't have the players encounter a lava field if there are no volcanoes nearby and there's no kind of real reason for there to be a lava field. At the same time, you might say, well, what if a lava field suddenly appeared here? What would happen? Well, the geography constrains you to realize that lava flows downhill, as do most liquids, so that means it's probably going to flow towards the ocean, and if there's a city in the path of that, maybe the player's characters need to be involved in preventing the lava from getting to the city, or diverting it, or figuring out where it's coming from in the first place. So do you see, by applying the constraint of geography and gravity, we suddenly start to get an adventure where there wasn't one before? So even when we say, well, where would this come from? It's just narrowing our focus down. At the same time, the other key principle, which I feel is absolutely intertwined with constraints. You can't think of a constraint, well, they go to the blacksmith. What constraints does a blacksmith have? The blacksmith has quite a few constraints. They're a blacksmith to begin with. They're not going to have the ability to stitch a cloak together. Their wife maybe, or their husband maybe, but not the blacksmith themselves. They will probably be able to work with metals and things, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to repair your trebuchet if it's wood that you're after. You probably want to go to a carpenter. So there are some constraints that come into place. But at the same time, sometimes the constraints are not obvious. And so we then have to fall back onto the second key principle. And the second key principle is expectation. Now, expectation is a very complex subject, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it on this particular video because we will come back to expectation throughout the series. Expectation, though, in the context of what we're talking about, in the bigger scheme of things, expectation is drawing on what you, as the GM, expect, or drawing on what your players expect. And you need to be able to be fairly agile in deciding, am I going to use my expectation, or am I going to use the player's expectation, or am I going to combine them together? And by expectation, I mean, if you have the party going up to a blacksmith, there's a lot of expectation. The blacksmith will be able to bend and forge and repair iron or metal products. The blacksmith will be able to shoe horses. The blacksmith will have a forge in their blacksmithy place. Their smithy, I think would be the technical term. Don't judge me, it's early. There could be a whole bunch of things that come with that expectation. Probably the blacksmith lives nearby. Why wouldn't they live nearby? Why would they live 100 miles away? That's not what we expect. So we look at those expectations, and those expectations just give us even more constraints. At the same time, we might hear the party saying, well, I hope the blacksmith knows how to work with gemstones. You as the GM might go, why would you think a blacksmith could work with gemstones? Or one of the other party members will go, that would be a jeweler, maybe, not a blacksmith. And in your head, as the GM, you're going, yes, that would be a jeweler. But would a jeweler really be able to sustain themselves in a village of 50 people? Who are they making jewelry for? There's not a lot of people there, and maybe they have a workshop here and they travel into the city, but if this is out in the middle of nowhere, why would there be a jeweler there? We don't expect there to be a jeweler there. But there's nothing stopping us from saying that the blacksmith has a hobby as a gem cutter. And that solves the problem. That gives the players what they're expecting, but not in a way in which they expected it. So it constrained us to now go, okay, well, the blacksmith has got this gem cutting hobby. Why does he have a gem cutting hobby? Well, maybe he's a part-time spelunker and he likes to go and search in caves and find rocks and things. Oh, that's interesting. It could also be that because he's going into these caves, he knows the local area and is aware of someone who's been hiding in one of these caves. Oh, okay. Now, all of this should be happening in your head whilst your players are going through the mundane processes of how much is it to repair my sword? I need my armor repaired. Have you heard of any local rumors? Well, now, by just applying some expectations and some constraints, we know that the blacksmith has got a problem with one of the caves that he goes to find his gemstones in order to practice his hobby has been overrun by goblins, kobolds, insert one by monster here that we expect to be in that region, and that will now constrain our adventure because if it's undead, we have a certain amount of expectations with undead, but we also have a certain amount of constraints with undead. They don't have a huge amount of intelligence, depending on the type of undead, yes, I know, and all that kind of stuff. So again, look at how constraints and expectations are kind of the yin and yang of each other. The expectations give us a whole lot of options. The constraints reduce those options down so that what happens is at the end of the day, you are sitting and making choices based along some actual parameters, some actual literal borders, rather than just trying to come up with options from everywhere. That's the key principle that you need to understand. Reduce your options so that you can choose the best option from a limited number rather than having an infinity of choice. That's what I say to you this week. Short video, relatively speaking, kind of, maybe, who knows. Anyway, who cares? I don't care. Hit that like button or hit the subscribe button or hit that bell if you want to show the channel some love. Let us know that you are enjoying this series, that you are deriving benefit from this series, because I hope that you are. I really do. Until next time, massive thank you to you for watching all the way through to the end. Huge thank you, big thank you, let's do the heart thing, to all of our patrons who support this channel. And until next week, I wish you and yours the very happiest of gaming.